This week, let us talk about Burundi in Punchback, the Pambazuka news production that brings you incisive comment and analysis of current affairs from a Pan-Africanist perspective with me, Henry Makori. Welcome. The small East African nation of just 10 million people has been in turmoil since April. Violent protests broke out in the capital Bujumbura after President Pierre Nkurunziza declared his intention to run for another term in the country's election. According to the president and his supporters, the constitution allowed him to run for another term because his earlier term, the first term that began in 2005, did not count. At that time, he had been elected by parliament and not by universal suffrage as required by the constitution. But the opposition, civil society, and other observers questioned President Nkurunziza's intention, claiming that he was actually intending to run for a third term in violation of the constitution and the Arusha Accords that had ended the country's bloody civil wars years earlier. The constitutional court in that country, however, ruled in favor of the president. And after 3 weeks of violent protests that claimed at least 19 people, most of them killed by the police and other security forces that had been deployed heavily in the streets of Bujumbura, an army officer emerged and declared a coup on May 13, while President Nkurunziza was attending a regional summit especially called to understand the crisis in Burundi. The coup did not last for long. After a few days, President Nkurunziza was back in power. And then, in the midst of the chaos and the violence that continued, the country went into elections in July. And during that election, President Nkurunziza emerged the winner with 69% of the vote. Most of the opposition parties boycotted the election. President Nkurunziza began his new term following his inauguration in a ceremony that was quiet, without much celebration, and which was boycotted by regional leaders. But since that time, the country has not stabilized. Attacks targeting journalists, civil society leaders, ordinary citizens continue in that country. And almost daily, there are reports from Burundi of some killing or some attack targeting all these forces that are opposed to Nkurunziza. The Burundian election is done and dusted, but the issue surrounding the third term refuses to go away. But President Nkurunziza is not the only one who is embroiled in this kind of conflict involving term limits. In East Africa, Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni several years ago did away with constitutional term limits. He orchestrated a constitutional change which removed term limits, allowing him to rule for life. Next year, President Museveni is gunning for another term, which is likely to win, and of course, is likely to rule for life. Burundi's neighbor, Rwanda, is also engaged in this business of third term. President Paul Kagame is almost sure now of running for another term because that country is in the process of removing term limits from the constitution, which then will allow President Kagame to be president for life. In recent weeks, the European Union has imposed sanctions, travel and other sanctions on top Burundian officials on the basis that they took important roles in the repression, the violent repression of protesters that has been happening in the country. Now, this kind of measures have not been targeted at other countries in the region, Uganda, Rwanda, Ethiopia, where there are massive and atrocious violations of human rights. Now, one asks, why is it that Burundi has been targeted in this way when there is a lot of repression in other countries in the region? In fact, Ethiopia, Burundi, Rwanda, and Uganda are very close allies of the West and do not suffer any kind of reproach. They do not suffer any kind of questioning from the Western powers on account of their atrocious human rights records. While visiting Kenya in July, American President Barack Obama dismissed the Burundian election as a sham. He said it was not credible at all. Yet, a few days when he visited Ethiopia, he described the regime there as democratically elected. That the Ethiopian regime is democratically elected. Get that? And yet, in May, when elections were held in Ethiopia, the ruling party won an incredible 100% of the vote. That means 546 of the seats, all the seats in parliament. That must have been credible indeed. Keen observers of the Burundian situation say that the country has not healed from many years of atrocities from its violent past. The 10 years of Nkurunziza have not brought the peace, the stability, and the prosperity that the people had hoped for. The regime is instead characterized by repression, by serious violations of human rights. Many journalists, civil society activists have had to flee the country to save their own lives. Many of them are also jailed. Others are already dead. The fear of return of violence pervades the country. It creates a pervasive fear of terror. And so there has been a lot of massive movement of people from that country, refugees fleeing to save their lives. In fact, according to one report in July, each week 2,500 Burundians were fleeing the country, heading to Tanzania alone each week. This state of national anxiety is crippling. When indeed will stability return to Burundi, so that the people can settle down, so that the people can look at the needs that they need to address, so that the people can address the development priorities that are urgent in that country? There have been calls from inside and outside the country for resumption of negotiations, for initiatives to end the paralysis that afflicts Burundi at the moment. But the initiatives by the regional leaders, by the East African community, seem to have floundered. There is little talk now about what should happen in Burundi, how the future of that country can be assured, how the present crisis can be ended. President Yoweri Museveni of Uganda, who was the regional mediator, has not said anything about Burundi for several weeks now. What are people waiting for? What are East African community leaders waiting for? How many people must die before there is intervention, before there is a sitting down around the table to hammer out difficult solutions for the healing of Burundi? There is another interesting dimension to the Burundian crisis. In fact, Pierre Nkurunziza and his government believe that their government is being destabilized by their neighbor Rwanda. And there have been situations where individuals from Rwanda, government officials, are believed, security people, are believed to have been found within Burundi. Interestingly, Burundi and Tanzania are the only countries in East Africa that have questioned Rwanda on account of its support for terrorist activities, for rebels in eastern DR Congo. Maybe this is why President Paul Kagame is no longer in friendly terms with his erstwhile comrade Pierre Nkurunziza. One of the biggest ironies of the Burundian crisis is that Burundi is a leading contributor of troops to the African Union mission in Somalia, AMISOM. That means Burundian soldiers are out there in Somalia trying to bring peace and stability. But back home, there is chaos, there is crisis, and nobody is attending to it from the region in a significant fashion. Our sisters and brothers in Burundi are not getting the attention that they deserve from the East African community and the African Union. This is a shame, big shame. Where is the so-called African solutions to African problems? Leaders of the East African community, the African Union, and all the people need to wake up now to our responsibility to the brothers and sisters in Burundi. We need to wake up now and put that country on the path of healing, of reconciliation, of peace, of stability, so that those brothers and sisters of ours can feel that they have brothers and sisters out here who look out for them. That needs to be done now.